1 minute silence for the departed soul. And then I would request Professor Asa Sarangi to continue the proceeding. So we can have 1 minute silence. Thank you very much. So, may I now request Professor Asa Sarangi and Professor Asa Sarangi to continue, and then Amir will come. Yeah, yes. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kumar, and let me first welcome all of you and thank you for being here with us today at the center. And it's indeed a very sober, sad moment for all of us who have been part of the life of Professor Imtiaz Ahmad as our teacher, as a scholar, as someone whom we admired a lot, both in his professional ethics as well as a person. So we thought we will meet online, though Professor Ahmad would have very much liked for us to be gathered somewhere in the Nukkad or Kona of JNU, and would have liked actually to see us sitting there in that university where he served for so many years. The fact was that we finished our exams, we ended our semester, and most of our students have gone home. And Professor Ahmad also had a lot of students, colleagues, friends who are all over in the country and outside the country. So we wanted to have most of those people through this online mode. So that's why we decided to have an online tribute sort of function in this way. I would just say a few words, and then we have a number of speakers, both his colleagues as well as his students, who would like to share their memories and pay tribute to Imtiaz sir. I will continue to call him Imtiaz sir. I can't call him Professor Ahmad, which I never called him in my life ever before. I would just like to say that he was not only a very far-sighted and original thinker and a scholar, but also someone who had tremendous sense of patience, both in class and outside. And I think the tributes that have poured in since last 1 week have reflected on this. How a university professor would never feel tired talking to students, getting hold of students, whether it was in KC or those days we used to have classes in the down campus. He would come sometimes wearing his overcoat in the morning, and once I asked him, sir, what is this? He said, well, I was working throughout the night and I think I'm properly dressed, even though he was always very, very nicely dressed. And he would never mind, talking for hours and hours to students, going beyond the call of his duty, going beyond simply giving lectures and teaching in the classroom, which I think is very rare these days. And we worry a lot about our own time, about our own privacy. But here was a scholar, world-renowned scholar, who never hesitated to talk to students and made them feel one and equal with him. Because he came from very simple, humble origins, and he therefore felt that students who were joining JNU since the 70s also came from different sections of the society who needed to have patient hearing. So I think this was one virtue, rather a very unparalleled sort of characteristic of Imtiaz sir that touched the heart and soul of many of us, almost all of us. And I think his works speak volume about his original scholarship. Way back in the 70s, when he began to talk about the caste system, social stratification, one had never thought what one can see today, that Muslims will get, reservation under OBC or other categories, which I think was an original contribution. Had he not talked about the caste and caste system within the community, probably the kind of welfare mechanism that has emerged would not have been there. So he was not only far-sighted, I think he was also very much conscious about the way in which the state functions, and he needed to reach out to the policy making domain as well. So I think that is his wonderful combination of both as a policy analyst as well as a thinker. And thirdly, I think he never bothered much about the Western theories or theoretical framework because he was so well original in his thinking. And I always thought he was a self-reflexive anthropologist among sociologists. We don't do anthropology in India. And here was a person who was doing daily ethnography on a daily basis, talking to people, going back to villages, and his writings also reflect that. And I think that he brought that very live into the classroom discussion when he spoke in not just English, he spoke tremendously beautiful English, poetic English, I would say, because he drew upon his vernacular skills quite a bit from Hindi, Hindustani, Urdu. He was excellent when it came to conversation and a great communicator he was. So, so I think he struck everyone as a very original, empathic, full of ideas, and full of love and affection. So much so that many of us were invited to his house every now and then, and he never hesitated to offer us. We could sit, offer us food, drink, whatever he had. He said, open the fridge, take out whatever you like. So I'm saying all these, even though these are very personal things, because he actually crossed the boundaries of being simply a teacher and did not have much of a, sort of limit when it came to reach out to students. He wanted to be part of their life, and students became part of his life. So it's very difficult for me to say anything further. Of course, I will say much more towards the end. But let me just say that CPS was very fortunate to have a person like him, and students who studied under him, both as a supervisor and a teacher, were also very, very lucky. And we miss him today, we'll continue to miss him. And I think his writings, his persona, his reflections, his memories will always remain in our heart. With these words, let me now call Professor Prabhat Patnaik, our JNU professor, who I think they have had a wonderful friendship and colleague and word of memories to share. And Professor Patnaik.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful that you have asked me to speak on this occasion. I suppose I can legitimately claim that I knew Imtiaz before almost anybody else in this gathering, because I'm much older, I suppose, than most people in this gathering. In fact, when I was an undergraduate student in Delhi University, we used to go to the Delhi School of Economics Cafe, where there would be a group of research students, including Imtiaz, and therefore he was a person that one got to see quite often. It was actually a very distinguished group of research students belonging to economics and sociology. And we would, as undergraduate students, amongst ourselves, point out that so-and-so is, let's say, Imtiaz Ahmad, so-and-so is J. Krishnamurti, so-and-so is Jayati Mitra, and so on. So they were all very distinguished people. And as a result, one was quite familiar with Imtiaz's name, appearance, and everything, though I didn't personally talk to him from a very early age. Then when we returned to JNU, not surprisingly, I found that he had joined the faculty of CPS. I say not surprisingly because those days, JNU attracted people so that anybody who was any good in academics actually gravitated towards JNU. So it was not very surprising that a person as distinguished as Imtiaz Ahmad should be a member of the JNU faculty. Then, of course, over a period of time, we got to know one another even better because Imtiaz became our neighbor. And his, he was our neighbor for years. And his younger son, Dweep, and my son were exact contemporaries. They were classmates in Sardar Patel Vidyalaya. And every morning we used to meet at the Sardar Patel bus at the north gate of the campus, where there would be a whole lot of JNU parents with their respective children waiting for the bus to come. And Imtiaz would be there, I would be there, Pushpesh Pant would be there, Panini would be there, and so on. So, over a period of time, I really got to know him very well. His, I suppose, what was very striking about Imtiaz, apart from his research, which was quite outstanding in my view, was the fact that he was an extraordinarily gutsy person. He was very gutsy and very tenacious. As everybody knows, I suppose here, there was a period in which there was a fallout between the then leadership of the CPS and Imtiaz. And this fallout continued for a very long time, during which he showed enormous amount of gutsiness and tenacity. One could disagree with Imtiaz, but one could never for a moment question the incredible courageousness of the person. He was an extraordinarily courageous person of the kind that you don't really meet very often in the academic world. Of course, his research was quite outstanding, about which other people, I'm sure, would speak much more knowledgeably. But you see, most of us, when we do research, we think in terms of some arcane subject, which has very little connection with people's lives, with the kind of quotidian living of people. But Imtiaz's research was of a different kind. He worked on the whole business of caste within Islam, and in the process, he was a very strong advocate of caste-based reservations being extended, the OBC reservations being extended to Muslims in India. In fact, I remember once the student union had invited both him and me to speak on the subject. Not that I am any expert, but I happened to that time be working in Kerala. And Kerala was one of the first states that actually had introduced reservation for Muslims in university admission and so on and so forth. So both he and I spoke, and he, of course, was a very strong supporter, advocate of reservations, OBC reservations being extended to Muslims, precisely because of the fact that caste or caste differences existed even among the Muslim community, as a matter of fact, even though this was not conceptually accepted. I suppose the real celebration of Imtiaz's work would really occur when this OBC reservation is extended to Muslims all over India, because even though reservations are not the best way of dealing with deprivation, we know that they help. And we know that actually the Muslim community has fallen behind, even compared to other communities which have got the benefit of reservations. So I suppose Imtiaz's work would be really celebrated, and Imtiaz would be very happy if you arrive the day that actually OBC reservation is extended to the Muslim community as well. And I think that's a day that we could all meet and celebrate and remember Imtiaz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik, and thank you for agreeing to come join and share your memories about Imtiaz sir. And I think he loved his life on campus. I could only add that he enjoyed every minute of it, because this was the space where he really belonged. He felt it. He the way he sort of interacted with everyone, with you, colleagues, students, and other families. And of course, I would just like to add that he was so courageous, bold, brave, iconoclastic to some extent, and extremely progressive, even though he didn't bind himself with any particular ideology or its framework. But his work, I mean, he was sometimes accused of being unfair to Islam because he considered Islam being as hierarchical, as inegalitarian as any other religion. And therefore, we need to pay attention to the system, like caste system within Islam. And he used to tell us when he was going through this very difficult phase of his life, he once shared that he was getting half salary probably from JNU, and he was finding it very difficult to manage his expenses. So he started writing a lot in the newspaper. And I used to joke with him, "Sir, you must be earning a lot of money now." He said, "I get 800 rupees for each article I write, and every week I write one article. So I've got some extra money, and every time I have some extra money and go and buy whatever I need." So that was the kind of conviction in himself, and also his sense of bravery. I think he fought with his strength and he stood for the principles, and he knew, and we were all with him, many of us as students joined him in his that difficult time. Let me call Professor Zoya Hassan, who was his colleague for many, many years in the center, and has spent a great deal of time as being colleagues and intellectuals in the same university. Professor Hassan, we would like to hear from you. Is Professor Hassan there? Zoya Hassan? Amir?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yes. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Yeah.
I too have had a very long association with Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. In fact, I could say in this group, perhaps the third longest association with him after Prabhat and Balveer, because Prabhat and Balveer joined the university before me, a couple of years before me, and I think Imtiaz joined the university in 1972 and Prabhat, I think, in 1973. And if I remember right, Balveer also joined in 1973 and I joined in 1975. So I've had a very long association with Imtiaz in the Center for Political Studies. We were colleagues for over 2 decades. Now, Imtiaz, of course, was an outstanding, a distinguished sociologist and an intellectual trailblazer in many respects. Imtiaz was known, as has already been noted by the previous speakers, he was known for his liberal, progressive, and innovative thinking. More than progressive, his innovative thinking on issues concerning society and culture, concerning Muslims, communal politics, ethnic conflict, social movements, middle classes, personal laws, uniform civil code. He intervened in significant ways on many of these issues. And he was always actively involved in responding to issues confronting Muslims and other marginalized communities too. As was just said, he often took very bold and unconventional positions. If there was one thing which defined Imtiaz Ahmad, it was his unconventionalism, so to speak. And what is more, as Prabhat very rightly pointed out, it is not just that he took unconventional positions, he vigorously argued them, pursued them, fought for them. He fought for the positions that he took on major political, social, and public issues, and also the numerous problems that he faced in the center. So he took, as Prabhat rightly pointed out, he took a very bold position, and he fought till the end, and also took positions on matters concerning the university. And besides that, I think, as Narendra rightly pointed out, he took a keen interest in various social movements, and often I've heard that he often provided advice He was like a philosopher, guide, and friend to many social movements. Now, Imtiaz has done seminal work on the sociology of Muslims in India. His pioneering work on social stratification, notably on caste among Muslims, was clearly ahead of its times. He edited 4 volumes which dealt with 4 different aspects of the Muslim community, centered on the question of stratification, religion and ritual, family and marriage, and modernization and social change among Muslims. Of these 4 volumes, the first and the last volume were particularly interesting and illuminating, that is to say, the ones that dealt with caste among Muslims and social change and modernization among Muslims. Now, he broke new ground by pointing out the existence of caste among Muslims, which demonstrated that social differentiation among Muslims was no different from that which existed among Hindus. Now, this was significant because when he published these volumes in the early 1970s, it was generally assumed that Muslims constituted a monolithic and homogeneous community. Now, Imtiaz Ahmad was quite emphatic in his conclusion that Muslims must not be viewed as a monolithic community. Now, this was a great advance because for the first time, the impact of caste on Muslims was systematically examined, systematically studied by him and his collaborators on this project. Now, Imtiaz Ahmad, in these volumes and the contributors to these 4 volumes, basically etched out, and especially the first volume, basically etched out the broad contours of how caste defines social ties among Muslims. There was, of course, more work to be done that needed to be done and has been done on these issues since the publication of these volumes in the 1970s. Arguably, his work was a precursor to the contemporary politics of what are now called Pasmanda Muslims. Now, his ideas have acquired new significance in recent years, and they've acquired a new significance in the changing context of Indian politics, particularly the new emphasis on Pasmanda Muslims. Now, his work created a fair amount of discussion, and it also led him and others to pursue the possibility of reservations, not only for OBCs, as Prabhat pointed out, but more importantly, I would argue, for Dalit Muslims. I'm myself a great advocate of reservations for Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians. And reservations for Dalit Muslims, which is really of much greater concern to me, I'll be very honest. So reservations for Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians, as we know, has been under consideration for decades. Governments have come and gone. They have created committees, formed committees, but really no progress. No tangible progress has been made on this issue, largely because it has faced huge opposition from various quarters, even though there are very good reasons and justification for granting reservations to both communities. When I was a member of the National Commission for Minorities from 2006 to 2009, one of the, and Hamid Ansari was the chairman, I think one of the major issues that we took up was reservations for Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims, and we did as much as we could by commissioning a major empirical study on the disadvantages and discriminations suffered by Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians on account of their inherited caste status. But of course, as expected. Nothing much came out of it. I would think that the greatest celebration of Imtiaz's pioneering and path-breaking work would be if reservations are granted to Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims. Because all said and done, OBC, Muslims have got some reservations in the OBC category in different states, particularly in North India. But there is none, absolutely no reservations, no recognition of the Dalit status of Dalit Muslims and Christians. So I believe the greatest celebration of Imtiaz's work would be when the government grants reservations to Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians. Now, in addition to this, of course, Imtiaz Ahmad was a staunch secularist, a believer in pluralism and India's composite culture. He went on to do considerable work on Islam in India, or rather, again, interestingly, on the specificities of Islam in the Indian context and how it was so deeply influenced by history, society, and culture of India. The Indianness of Islam was a central thread running through much of his writings and many of the pieces that he wrote later for the Economic and Political Weekly. Importantly, his work emphasized the distinct difference between textual religion and the way religion is lived and practiced in everyday life. In other words, the lived life of Muslims is not an exception to this basic social fact. Finally, I would say, and I think my comments would be incomplete without making this point, and that is that, of course, Imtiaz was a great public speaker, but more importantly, he was a great seminarist whose interventions and questions in seminars opened up new areas of social and political research. So I think for a long time, Imtiaz will be remembered for his detailed exploration of the sociological aspects of Muslim life in India and for setting the terms of debate on Indian Muslims by bringing in a more empirical, grounded focus on the study of Muslims in the 1970s and for opening up the caste question among Muslims thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hassan, with those beautiful words about Imtiaz sir. And I would agree with you that when he published these volumes, and there was a seminar held at the University of Chicago on these 4 volumes, where he also went as a Fulbright scholar, and he continued to tell his students how rigorous the discussion was on these 4 volumes while he was a Fulbright scholar there. I would also like to add just one more thing, that in the center, till he retired, and later on, I took on the course of political sociology, a core course for our MA teaching that we taught for several years. And I could see how Professor Imtiaz Ahmad's reflections were woven in this course. And no doubt, we are mourning his passing away, but I think we're also celebrating a life which lived to the fullest as an academic, as an intellectual, as a global thinker. May I now invite Professor Balveer Arora, another of Professor Ahmad's colleague since the 70s, to share his fond memories about him.
Thank you, Asha. And yes, I think it's the privilege of age that Prabhat referred to, that you become the one who has known someone the longest. It's just the passage of time. And but I am very happy to see some of his students who have also now retired from service. I see Ajay Mehra, who wrote a beautiful tribute to him recently. I see Amit. And since Narendra had organized 50 years of CPS, and we had occasion to reminisce about so many things, I'd like to go back to those days. the foundational days, because the way CPS was conceived was not the conventional interdisciplinarity of interaction amongst discipline-based centers, but by having, and it was a novel experiment, and only time will tell if we manage to pull it off. Having, for example, an economist, Krishna Bhardwaj was a member of the center, and I remember he decided to move to the CESP, and I was allotted the room that she was occupying. In those days, we were in that, what you call it, down campus. Is it up campus or down?
Old campus.
Old campus, which was the abandoned buildings of the IAS academy that was supposed to come there. And our offices were huge rooms for IAS trainees with a bathroom attached. So imagine my delight as a young assistant professor to have such a huge room with a huge desk and a bathroom with which Krishna Bhardwaj had a. Imtiaz was a sociologist, similarly placed in the center, and it was he was a sociologist who truly incorporated a branch of political science which has grown, which has come to be known as political sociology, which Asha now is teaching. Imtiaz, as Zoya mentioned, was an excellent seminarist. I think that is one thing that I remember about him, that we had the most extraordinary exchanges in seminars. He was an excellent conversationalist. He could keep you enthralled on this, that, and the other. And it was a remarkably pleasant social interaction that we had. His influence on later studies on Muslims in India by colleagues. I particularly recall someone, a common friend who was Violet Graf, who died, who was working on Muslims in Lucknow and never failed to get us together. I think his influence stretched beyond the books that Zoya mentioned, in terms of his ability to persuasively argue and convince colleagues in fora, notably in seminars and so on. So I think we have to pay tribute to someone who managed, despite significant adversities, and I was a ringside viewer of these adversities that he suffered, that he was, his fluidity as a speaker, I think, developed because he was deprived of the classroom in a formal sense. He could no longer take classes over it. And so he managed to keep up his interests and his interactions with students on campus, with colleagues on campus, as Prabhat has just said. He was a neighbor, and from what I heard from others, that he had an excellently manicured garden on campus, which was his delight. Gave quite a different connotation to Voltaire's cultivating your garden, when he was really quite remarkable. His contribution to the study of the Muslim community and its stratification, I think, has been talked about, and notably Zoya has given a very sound reason for continuing to focus on the question of reservation of Dalit Muslims as for Dalit Christians. And we are all convinced that there is nothing that should hold back in terms of equity and justice pursuing this path. I would like to conclude by saying that Imtiaz was above all an extremely pleasant conversationalist to be around with. He was someone who was easy going, unfailingly courteous, and very, very alive and adaptable to the needs and the changes around us. And that experiment of having a sociologist in the Center for Political Studies, if anyone could make it work, it was Imtiaz Ahmad. He was circumstances willed otherwise, and we know that his contributions then, from a certain time, became more outside the center than within the center. So I would thank you for asking me, and I would say that we will remember him. We will remember him through his students, also who will no doubt speak later, and we will remember him through his work. We will remember him through our common friends, and he is someone who really I was privileged to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arora, even though you are in Paris, and thank you for joining us and sharing your memories of Professor Ahmad. I would just like to add from my own experience that he was a great seminarist, and I remember in one of the seminars 20 years back, we were together in Goa, and when I read my paper, later on he told me, as an academic, you should not be reading out your paper, you should be speaking out. And while speaking, you should be thinking about what you have written rather than reading out. I think those were the kind of very friendly, in a very friendly way, and in a very mentoring manner that he used to advise us. And that really shaped many of us in both professional life and personal life. Very witty, I would say, had a tremendous sense of humor. And if you were not able to communicate through a simple, language, he was there to communicate it. Nobody could communicate it better than him. And so the early foundational years of CPS, where all of you built up the center, became a flagship center, I think we still thrive on the early foundations of CPS. And we have people from those generations here in the group today. They will share their memories. But yes, what a place it must have been in the 70s. In the 80s and 90s, also it was a place which was very different from now what we see as part of the institutional control under different kinds of regimes. Okay, so let me now call upon Dr. Amir Ali, who is now with us in the center as a colleague, but also is someone who was taught by Professor Ahmad after he was reinstated, and probably the only last batch that he taught. So a gap of 14 years of lonely life, to some extent, isolationist life, but also a life lived with bravery and the kind of courage that he showed, I think, must have come back in his interaction in the classroom. Over to you, Amir, for your words.
Thank you so much, Asha. Thank you. It's always difficult to talk about Imtiaz Sahab, as we would refer to him very reverentially, I must say, as a great scholar. I was, I think, amongst the last batch of students to be taught by him before his retirement. So he'd just come back after his period of suspension, which was a very long one. And he never taught us in the master's program. We were very intrigued by him because we'd heard so much about him. But when he offered an optional course when we were doing our MPhil, it was pressure groups in India, I still remember. Many of us just took up the course because we had heard so much about him, and we were not disappointed at all. As many people have mentioned, his career at CPS was truncated by that unfortunate, I think it was a 14-year-long suspension, and when he'd come back and he began teaching, when you begin teaching after a long gap, it obviously affects the way you teach. But I must say, he really hit the ground running in terms of the way that he taught us. And many people talk about his scholarship being path-breaking. I'll come to that in a bit. But what struck me about his teaching was how irreverent it was. There was this kind of informality in the way that he would speak. And what he had to say in class would never be confined to the 2-hour, the length of the 2 hours that were allotted to him. Inevitably, it would flow beyond that. And then we would kind of follow him to the canteen, or perhaps we would walk back home with him. I used to live in Periyar Hostel in those days, so we would walk back towards Dakshinapuram, and then he would quite often invite us to his house, the well-tended garden, as many people talked about, 72 Dakshinapuram, I still remember. It was actually on those walks back from the center that one would really see his scholarship unfolding in very unpredictable ways, I must say. So when we would be sitting in his garden, he would then kind of, unwind the conversation. I mean, there was that very Hindustani logic of the, what can we call academic gupshup, when, the really interesting insights would come out from the most informal conversations that we would have. So amongst these conversations, I still remember these often agonized conversations that we would have on the predicament of the liberal Muslim, as we would call it. Now, whenever these would come up, I remember he had that mischievous twinkle in his eye, and he would say, is there such a thing? It's such an oxymoron, contradiction in terms. And then we would go on talking about this. So the art of the conversation, which to my mind is increasingly being lost in the kind of university spaces that we are occupying, is something that he represented in quite remarkable ways. There was a particular manner of conversation, which Professor Arora has also pointed out, was easygoing, it was informal, it had the element of the unpredictable, I must say, because you never knew what was coming next, as he would begin to almost unwind, especially in the garden. So that, I think, is something we have seemed to have lost. I'm one of those people, of course, much younger than the speakers who preceded me. So I consider myself as someone who grew up in the CPS that Professor Ahmad was, of course, a faculty member in. Now I'm growing older and also inevitably graying. I must say that in this aspect, this kind of scholarship we seem to be losing. I think it's worth treasuring because it has a certain kind of insight that is unique and irreplaceable. And quite often it makes me very sad to see the kind of very motivated academia that we have these days. When you go to a seminar and you publish a paper and you think, okay, I will only talk to a certain set of people who can give me a certain insight. Professor Ahmad never had that. And Imtiaz was someone who was kind of open to all kinds of conversations. And quite often he would meet us at the dhaba when we were having chai. Or I remember one instance when we were having banta, and he asked me, what exactly are you having? I said, this is a drink called banta. And I said, would you mind if I tried? And of course, we said, of course, sir, you're most welcome. And then he sat with us and we had that inevitable conversation. But let me come to his scholarship, because I think the remarkable thing about his scholarship and what really sets him apart is the fact that it was so closely entwined with the messiness of the political. And in that messiness, as I call it, he could, he had the insight which would be able to bring out the most relevant issue. Now, the fact that his scholarship has actually been able to influence a whole political discourse, I think, is testament to the power of how powerful his political and sociological insight was. Professor Zoyson pointed this out, the fact that the Pasmanda movement has emerged largely because of his writings on caste and social stratification among Muslims in India, is, I think, one of the most remarkable achievements that any academic can boast of. We often think of academics as being locked up in their ivory towers, talking about things which are abstruse and abstract. But here we have someone who's actually being able to influence the cut and thrust of the political. So what struck me as someone who's done political theory was that I gained a certain kind of insight, which I often felt that political theory was trying to impose its very neat categories on this messiness and lack of predictability of politics. And every time I've tried to do my own, the way that I try to do political theory, I've always drawn from that distinct, unique insight, sociological insight that I always found in Imtiaz Saab's writings and also his conversations. On this point about the Pasmanda movement, I think what makes it so significant, especially from the way that it's drawn from his writings, is, of course, the point that Professor Hassan mentioned, that the Muslim community is by no means homogeneous. It is stratified and heterogeneous. But I think what his writings have been able to kind of pave the way for is the possibility of a certain democratization within the Muslim community, which is very, very significant. It has always been dominated by a certain kind of Ashraf elite. And if one were to kind of think of his writings as leading to a kind of a democratization and a de-Ashrafization of the Muslim community, I think this would be perhaps one of the most remarkable achievements of any academic in terms of how his scholarship has translated into politics on the ground. I must move on to a slightly sadder part of Imtiaz Ahmad as a scholar. Again, Professor Arora mentioned this, and many other speakers have pointed this out, which was that the potential that he actually had as a scholar was actually it wasn't actualized as much as it should have been. He was brilliant. A lot of students have asked me, and I was very touched when I saw, the current students of CPS turn up for the funeral. Supriya was there. And a lot of students have asked me what he was like, as a teacher. And I can say that there was something very significant, something very different in the way that he would go about his teaching. It didn't have a seriousness to it. He didn't take himself very seriously. There was a certain kind of a self-deprecating humor that he would often indulge in. And I think his scholarship actually was enriched by this particular, as I said, this twinkle, that mischievous twinkle in his eye whenever he spoke. I'll never forget it. And I think scholarship must bring back some of these elements, which we are fast losing in the kind of very institutionalized university spaces that we now exist and occupy. But it is a little sad that a scholar of such repute and such potential was not able to actualize that kind of potential as much as he should have. I think CPS is in many ways impoverished precisely because of the inability of someone like Imtiaz Ahmad to actually be able to bring about the full scope of his academic potential. My last point, I must say, again, I say this with a great deal of sadness because I consider myself to be that generation which is, in a very futile way, trying to act as a torchbearer to a set of older academics which has infused and brought a certain kind of commitment to the cause of scholarship that JNU was. Imtiaz Ahmad was certainly one of those people. He was a great public speaker. He was in fact, one of the most sought-after public speakers in those unique JNU things that we call the after-dinner public meeting. So when I think about the future, and I must say I'm very worried, many of us have this almost impossible task of now, as I said, trying to act as futile torchbearers to, kind of pass on the legacy that we have experienced as students in the classroom, in the conversations that we've had with older faculty members like Professor Hassan, like Professor Arora, of course, Imtiaz Ahmad as well. But it's a very uncertain kind of a future. And I think the challenge becomes that much more difficult. But I'm reminded of conversations that I had with Imtiaz Ahmad, in which he said, life is never going to be like the way that you expect it. There'll be twists and turns. There'll be a lack of predictability. The challenge is to go on despite whatever happens. So on that note, with great respect, we'd often refer to him as Ustad Muhtaram, most respected teacher. CPS and JNU, of course, will never be the same again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amir, for those moving words and tribute to Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. And I agree, I can't agree more with you than the fact that, yes, those 14 years must have impacted him psychologically, mentally, emotionally, but he never let that come. When it came to interact with the students, with friends, colleagues, we always felt that he was battling it alone, even though we were with him. And I'm so glad to hear from you that you were his last student and he brought everything alive in the classroom. I would just like to share one. It comes to my mind. I also think he must be laughing at us from above when we talk about him in this way, because he was someone who never cared about really anybody criticizing him or he had a great sense of humor, sarcasm in himself, and he took things in his own stride. He once said, the simple way to understand demand and supply principle is the following. You go to any temple or any religious place, you will see the principle of demand and supply working there. I said, how? He said, you will see, the kind of things that you need to offer to God and goddesses are being sold there. So there is a demand, there is a supply. And it is still in my memory how he explained. And this was his way of, explaining and clarifying even the difficult concepts in the class. So he did mention once during those terrible years that he was fighting the case, and eventually he won and proved that there is a justice and there is a certain way in which you should fight, that he almost lost the interest for teaching. But I think it must have been not difficult for him to bring himself back to teaching once again. Okay, now we have a lot of Professor Imtiaz Ahmad's students who have moved out of JNU and have joined different professions. And we have one of them here who was, I think, Professor Ahmad's first student, Dr. Ajay Mehra, who himself has retired, but kept in touch with Professor Ahmad all his life. And I could see him frequently visiting him in JNU and outside JNU. Was the first student who finished his MPhil and PhD under Imtiaz sir. So we would like to hear from you, Ajay, about your teacher, how you remember him and what you would like to share with us. Oh, you are muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Asha. Thank you very much for including me in this panel. I'm here not to learn, but to celebrate a great teacher whom through academic association I began addressing as Guruji, and he remained, it started jokingly, but Guruji, he remained all his life to me and to my family as well. A lot has already been said. Let me limit myself to 2-3 things. A, of course, my personal experience. B, a little about his academic versatility. Some of the things that I thought I will say about his work, Zoya has already explained in great detail, so I cannot do it better than that. But I will, talk about his versatility, how he, even during profession, he guided me from time to time. When I entered the room where I was interviewed for my MA sometime in July 1973, a simple 20-year-old from Patna, not so fluent in English, spoken English, and I, sitting outside, I was terrified with thunderous laughter of Professor Bhamri. I thought, I don't know what is going to happen to me. And there, Professor Vora was also there, Professor Seshadri, Professor Rafiuddin Khan, and Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, who comforted me, but he kept quiet throughout the interview. He looked very charismatic. When our timetable came, I got admission. When our timetable came, his name was not there, so we didn't know what he was. We knew he was a sociologist. But one day he entered our class and he said he was going to offer a course on politics and society in India. And I went for it. And it was really, eye-opening. I studied in Patna University political science in a very traditional way. And here it was, the perspectives that were coming at how society and politics fused and how it led to several kinds of what we call mobilities, both horizontal and vertical, and so on and so forth. So then he also taught, a course on socialist thought, and that was also very illuminating to us. Then came, my MPhil interview, where I had presented, a proposal for the study of Panchayati Raj. And that was emergency time, 1975. And he says that I'm very disappointed that none of the students is coming with something very, very challenging. I smiled and said, look, I will be very happy to go for something challenging, but I don't want police coming and knocking at my door. It had already happened, and we were all rounded up, between, around, in the lawn, around the three hostels in Dakshinapuram, Kaveri, Periyar, and Godavari. I was a Kaverian. Professor Gandhi again let out his famous laughter, and Professor Ahmad kept quiet. But then, I had difficulty in selection of topic. I didn't know how to go about it. I discussed with many of the faculty members, but not with Professor Ahmad till then. And one day I was in the CPS office looking for some papers and so on, and he entered, pleasantly with his palm-filled, mouth, and shook his head at me very pleasantly. So I didn't know what to say. He said, "क्या कर रहे हैं? क्या टॉपिक चुना?" या सर कुछ हो ही नहीं रहा है, मैं क्या करूं, मुझे समझ में नहीं आ रहा, फेलोशिप भी नहीं दे रहे हैं आप लोग, मैं तो कुछ करके चला जाऊंगा. तो he laughed. He said, कल मेरे ऑफिस में मिलिए आफ्टरनून. So I went. And after a little chit chat, then he says, कुछ नया कीजिए, ये सब पुरानी चीजों में क्या रखा है, मैंने कहा क्या नया करूं. Then he suggested, पुलिस पे कर सकते हैं आप, आर्मी पे कर सकते हैं आप, सिनेमा पे कर सकते हैं आप. मैंने कहा मैं पुलिस पे करूंगा, मेरे फादर पुलिस में हैं, he is पुलिस इंस्पेक्टर इन बिहार, ये सब तो पुलिस पे ही कीजिए. And that is, how I entered a field I never thought that as a political scientist I would study. And that has become a lifelong passion. I was, the way I was guided and trained by him, I still keep writing, and some of my writings have been, liked by people. I even was a member of the Task Force 5 of the Punchi Commission that dealt with policing and internal security matters. I owe all that to him. And then, of course, everyone has talked about those very unpleasant days of his stay in CPS. And, when the attack was opened on him, and the first target was I. And in the PhD interview, I was asked a very uncomfortable question, because with his advice, I have shifted away from police, because he said, you have written practically raised all the relevant questions, even though you did not do your field work, you used your life as field work, and that was fantastic. And so move to something else. So I read a lot, thought a lot, and then I told him that I would like to work on urban politics or politics of urbanization. That appears very fascinating to me. And he immediately formulated that you work on politics of urban redevelopment in the walled city of Delhi. That is how it was formulated, not very easily accepted at the center, and the tussle went on till eventually it was approved, and I started my field work. And that field work was made very, very enriching with his guidance. That is one aspect, which must be highlighted, how to frame a questionnaire. First he said, you go and just walk around and talk to people. I did, and it was not up to his satisfaction. Then he sat with me and we prepared 2 questionnaires, and he said that now you go ahead and you start meeting people. He gave me a few contacts, and the least I say more I say, it is very little about that experience. When I came back and told him that, look, I mean, it is breaking all the stereotypes I have of society and Muslims particularly, he laughed heartily that अभी बहुत सारे stereotypes टूटेंगे, आप जाइए तो सही, मिलिए और लोगों से नोट कीजिए, be observant, keep writing, even if you are walking just like that, all those observations you must come back and note down and so on. And I mean, I must say that I will not be praising myself, but still I must say that writing my PhD thesis became a real experience with all those observations that I brought in with his advice and his training. And the second thing that I would like to say that both my work in MPhil dissertation and my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis is also corrected at a difficult time when his chronic injury had broken. And he went sentence by sentence. Not a sentence was missed. I am not talking of page. And with very detailed editorial work, detailed suggestions on how to rewrite certain sections. And another good thing was that he would give very strict deadline. And I remember there were times we used to laugh at the hostel, भैया deadline में कुछ तो लिख के देना है और कुछ लिख के हम दे देते थे. But he never got angry. He would say, अरे इससे काम नहीं चलेगा, थोड़ा बेहतर कीजिए. So, that pleasantness with which he encouraged that, you have to really, and he said, there is no shortcut to success. If you want to be successful in any part of your life, you must work very, very hard. So these things I always kept in my mind, and it really helped. On research, I would also like to bring out my experience that later also, when I did research, when I had joined CPR and I was doing project called People's Participation in Family Planning, and there I was supposed to be framing a questionnaire. Again, I went to him, sat with him, and then he guided me how to frame a questionnaire that would measure participation. And he says two things: you measure participation at the general level, and then you measure participation in family planning. Then only your study would be enriching. Otherwise, a routine, questionnaire is not going to help. That was one thing. Then I was always fascinated while staying in JNU hostel in America. So I thought that these urban villages need to be studied. So I took a project from ICSSR I think in the 80s, and I went to him for perspectives and so on and so forth. So he said, ML Srinivas ko padhiye, unki village wali kitab padhiye, and go to the villages and meet some dominant people and go and keep observing and so on and so forth. A brief study that was published only as a chapter, Urban Villages of Delhi. I put it on the academia, and I tell you, the number of hits, it is in thousands. That today I am informed by academia that number of hits on my paper on urban villages in Delhi is in thousands, all across, not only all across the country, but internationally. So, that's the kind of perspective that he had. Everyone has talked about. I thought I will bring it out through my personal experience. In my personal experience also, as he became my Guruji, I was also adopted by his family. So I had a home away from home. Of course, the tragic separation also impacted, but Professor Channa, she has continued to remain my motherly sister all along, even now, even today. She keeps the right to advise and scold me. I think the beginning was through the same association, and his house was like an ashram where students would always stream in. At least a cup of tea was ensured, but beyond that, an invitation to the dinner table was also, not unexpected. So this is how this aspect of his academic work that I wanted to point out, because Zoya almost stole my thunder by making such a wonderful presentation of his work. But I would like to, I have contributed a piece to the Wire, and I was looking around, and one thing that I would like to highlight by reading out from his 1972 article, a quotation, his plea for an Indian sociology, just a sentence, and that is on which I would end. I quote, "A better criterion would be whether the available literature tells us as much about the structure about non-Hindu groups and socio-cultural processes that have been operating amongst them as it does about Hindu." Thank you very much, Asha. Thanks a lot. We celebrate his life. I'll keep celebrating all my life till my alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. I think a teacher makes the student's life, but students also makes teachers' life worth living. And I think your words will echo with our students, and I wanted them to hear all of you because they have not been able to hear people like Imtiaz sir. I would just like to add that he had a very interesting way of talking in the class. I remember when he was teaching about social stratification, and a classmate of mine shared recently, which I think I was talking to him about Imtiaz sir. He said when social stratification, he was explaining, so this person comes from a science background, so he thought it is something to do with the stratosphere. So he wrote in the answer that social stratification is vertical, because he thought it was regarding stratosphere, right? Geographical sort of. So Imtiaz sir read it. Those days, of course, they used to read every sentence, word, letter of the student's writing and said, it can never be vertical. What are you writing? It's a social science concept. It's always horizontal. So I think those statements, those reflections have stayed with us after almost 4 decades. It's because of the way in which he connected in a very, very easy way. So thank you, Ajay, for sharing. And also, I think he was someone who was anti-elitism. And he always said that, academics should not be so elitist. What is there to feel so elitist about? So I think there was an effort on his part to be like a commoner and not to behave like an elitist. And that to a university professor, he once said, what is there for us? What is there with us that we should feel so elitist about ourselves? There's much more to say, but the time is running out. So let me now call upon Dr. Satya Sahu, who was again Professor Imtiaz Ahmad's student and has known and worked with him for the last 4 decades, or 5 decades rather. Satya, are you there? Satya Sahu? Subhendu Ghosh. I don't know. Okay, I think, I don't know. He was supposed to speak. He's somebody who worked as a personal secretary with our president, K.R. Narayanan, and he was sharing some very fond memories with me the other day, how Professor Imtiaz Ahmad was invited by K.R. Narayanan. He had things to share. Maybe he will join us a little later. I'll just call him. Let me call Nalini Ranjan Mohanty, if he's there. Nalini? He is someone who wrote again a beautiful obituary on Imtiaz sir immediately after his passing away. And he wanted to share some thoughts with us, but it seems he's also not here. Amir, can you check with the students if they have joined or if they had any difficulty in joining maybe?
I'll just ask, but in the meantime, I think Tanveer is here, who's next on the list.
Yeah, Tanveer, are you there? Tanveer is someone who was a student in CSSS, but
Nija is also around. I think Nija.
Who is around?
Nija.
Oh, Nirja. Okay, I just saw her. Yeah, Nirja, thank you for joining us.
No,
it's really nice of you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was in a PhD viva just before this, so I wasn't able to join sooner. I listen.
I would like to.
I'll just listen to others. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Is Tanveer there? Tanveer?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Thank you, Tanveer. Thank you for coming and joining. And I know you have already written on Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, but we would like to hear more from you and your association with him.
Yeah, the interesting part is since when you people were talking about him being your colleague or someone about him being his student, I have never been formally in either a colleague or a student of Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. But I would be among those multitudes who were touched by his scholarship. And somewhat the person is very distant. And why I say distant is because I and except for the period when I was working in the such a committee and I was actually tasked to write a chapter on Muslim OBCs and where I was very frequently in contact with Professor Imtiaz. In fact, much of the argument, because of his seminal contribution on Muslim social stratification and particularly on the question of caste, that we were dependent on him, and the kind of argument which you see in the that chapter is it has the shadow of Professor Imtiaz Ahmad very much there. However, at the same time, Professor Imtiaz Sahab's passing away is so difficult to actually reconcile with this, because, of course, it was he has been ailing for some time, very frequent visit to hospitals, etc. But he came back every time better than what the way as he went to the hospital. So this time again, there was an expectation that he would be able to, win over. However, these were the last days. But why it is also difficult to reconcile is that he was present in and around you all the time on every question which confronted the society or the politics, etc. You will see Professor Imtiaz Ahmad in some ways or the other, irrespective of what situation was he in, that he would be intervening. In the last days, last years, particularly during the pandemic and after, he took to the social media and was very actively present there. In fact, and the same gutsiness and courage and his incisive comments which he would make was very much there. At the same time, he recognized the fact that the social media is not a platform to make very complex arguments. However, in his own simple style, he would like to raise those questions. And many times he was, as it happens, those who are there on social media would know, very polarized opinions, and he would be attacked vehemently from the right wing particularly. And still, it did not deter him. He continued. And at the same time, what I could see is that he was, in his interventions, he would never be rebuking others, even if when he was taking up questions which were those which might raise, very, might raise tempers, etc. But at the same time, the comments which he would receive, some of them were extremely abusive, and yet he would, engage with them and try to provide a rational answer to what he had, the question which he had raised, the position he had advanced. And this was something which he probably continued all through his life. Even in the early days, I recall the work on social stratification actually, overshadowed all his other works. when he came to study caste, there were already some amount of literature available on caste. The colonial census had already been published. But this was the first work which, which drew from field data. And hence it was extremely rich. And it also, tried to address the question from an entirely different approach. And therefore, you will see that there's no, in sociology particularly, if you go around the country, there is no syllabus on social stratification which would miss this particular work, although it is now in 1973 or 78 work, but yet it continues to be present and read and debated. But I would recall another very important work of his in the 1969, when I think there were a series of communal riots in the 1960s, and Professor Ahmad's this EPW piece was very interesting, where he argued that all these ideas about civilizational tolerance, etc., is not going to provide the social edifice or philosophical edifice for secularism to survive in India. If the secular state was a rupture, was a departure from all other previous practices, and therefore the secular state needed to be interventionist. And this led to people trying to, argue that, well, Imtiaz Ahmad is suggesting that the state is secular, the society is communal. But this is not probably the gist of his argument. And later on, after the Gujarat riots, I remember again he wrote, where he probably sought to revise his position, arguing that, in fact, he lamented that the state, which was supposed to take this mission of secularization, had actually failed, and not only failed, had allowed itself to be appropriated by the forces of communalism. So this also, I think, in terms of his politics, apart from the question about the question of emancipation of lower castes, etc., particularly so amongst Muslims, this question of communalism, the growth of right wing, the way in which majoritarianism has grown in societies, this continued to bother him all through. And in the latest phase, particularly, he was more associated with it, given the situation in which we live. I think Professor Zoya Hassan was right in arguing that how his entire mission was to Indianize Islam, to Indianize. And through this, he actually was trying to, express his differences from two kinds of distortions. One which was coming from theology, which emphasized on only scriptures and did not allow any kind of, mutation to be accepted within the religion. And the other was this whole discourse influenced by the nationalist kind of scholarship, which came to which suggested towards the exogenic origins of Muslims and Islam, etc. Even in sociology, this trend was very, very powerfully present. And in fact, much of the sociology of M.N. Shrivas or many other stalwarts was largely associated with, largely conflated the Indic with the Hindu civilization. And Imtiaz Ahmad's intervention again, intervened very powerfully in a debate which ran for amongst many key sociologists on visualizing the sociology for India, and where he argued that how the sociology for India cannot miss the sociology of the societies or social formations of non-Sanskritic traditions such as Islam and Christianity. So in that sense, I see that his contribution has been immense. But most importantly, of course, has been the openness with which he would, come to deal with any question, or even students, etc. I first met him probably when I was a graduation student in JNU. And one of the reasons why I was drawn towards JNU was, apart from many others, was of course Imtiaz Ahmad, hoping that when I join the MA program in CSSS, I will be taught by Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. Only when I joined did I realize that he was actually a faculty in political science. And not only was he a faculty in political science, but besides, he was also, during that time, not teaching because of his suspension. However, his house was always open, and during my association with student politics, I remember a number of times we would go to his house and call him for post-dinner talks. And I think this was one way through which he continued to, relate with students, relate with also the everyday politics of the student life. If Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, someone is mentioning how much of JNU he was, and which is actually true. But at the same time, you would also see that he also took JNU outside, and wherever he would go, this is what his approach would be generally. I've seen him in Manu, I've seen him in other places where he would directly go into conversation with the people around, with the students, with even those who were sometimes not necessarily in academic roles, but at the same time, this amount of conversation, he once disclosed that this is because of this indirect and direct conversations which he would enter, that he was able to gather a huge amount of information, and which was probably one of his methods as well. I would only say that we will of course miss him forever, but there is a whole legacy of which he has left, and one of his most important one is what is mentioned is about the courage without which you cannot probably do social science truly. And secondly, of course, which is related to it, is the intellectual integrity, which he always, represented. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my views.
Thank you, Tanveer. And that was the reach of Imtiaz to go beyond center, beyond university, beyond the country. I think that was an exceptional teacher he was. We have Dr. Satya Sahu with us. Satya Sahu? Yes. I think there is some problem with connectivity. We can't hear you properly. Can you reconnect and see?
Okay, I will reconnect. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it is better.
What I'm saying is, I'm just in a car. I'll be reaching in a few minutes, maybe less than 5 minutes. So then after that I can speak and somebody else can go ahead.
Okay. You want to come in after 5 minutes?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, we'll wait for you after 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I think the speakers who wanted to speak have all spoken. Maybe I can share some of my own thoughts. Yes, Sumitra, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to make few my personal experiences, because most of my teachers, my colleagues, they have already spoken about him. I have nothing to say much except that I am the student who have come in touch with him the day I joined JNU in 1980 in CPS, and since then, the last time when I met him was this time in the Eid, this May when I met him last. I think in the last 43 years, perhaps I have always felt closest to him as one of my teacher from JNU. Though many of us, many teachers, I was with them in touch, but he is the one probably I was very close to him. I just want to say a few things about him. I have shared with him all his good and bad times. I cannot say what were those moments when he shared with me on campus, out of campus, during many places when he took me with him during the seminars, during many of the conferences, even outside Delhi, he said, "You come with me." Many things I have learned as a student, as a researcher, and as a teacher from him. When I was about to, finish, I was finishing my MPhil and I finished my MPhil, and then I had the opportunity to publish it, and it was on caste politics in Bihar, and it was under Professor Joya Hassan. So I requested him, "Ki, sir, can you write a forward?" And he said, "Ki, well, I will like to write about it." He wrote my first forward in that book in 1989. And after that, I had another opportunity to get one of my work published. It was a collected work of a seminar on the diaspora. And this is where again he wrote the forward of that book. And actually, this was my dedication to him. And this book I dedicated to him. This is the name of the book, Indian Diaspora in the Era of Globalization. And this book was dedicated to Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, and this was 2012. This was 2012 when this book was published. So, I have no words to say about him, what I feel about him, because I'm very emotional about him. Uh, it was such a moment of me when I came to know this news, disbelieving, shocking, but at the same time I have to accept it. And with my fellow colleagues, I would say my friends from the CPS of 1980 batch, I circulated this news there within that group. Everybody was shocked. Everybody wrote about Imtiaz, what they all felt about Imtiaz Saab. Imtiaz Ahmad was not only as a great teacher, great academician, great scholar, researcher. Many of us have spoken about him. There is nothing more to add I can do. But he was a great humanist. He was a great human being. And that is the quality I think which touched everybody entirely across the section of society, across the caste, creed, religion, region, languages, no barrier for him. He was the one person who touched everybody's, by the way he spoke to them, by the way he helped them, whatever way he could help them, he never said no to anybody. That is the quality which Professor Imtiaz had. Because normally I used to visit him during Eid and Diwali, the one festival. It was the one festival he used to love it. During the campus time also, he used to, decorate his house with the diyas and all. He said, "I love this festival." So I used to visit him on these two occasions and other occasions also whenever he used to ask me to come. And I always felt that he had such a love for this country. He had such a love for the people, and he wanted to do so much for the peoples. And whatever he did, I think he did to his best. And he is the one person who will never be erased in the memory of anybody, including students like me, who have been associated with last 43 years. And I remained as his student. He always was for me as a friend, philosopher, and guide. And I have no words to say that he was a great, great human being, apart from his scholar, teacher, and intellectuals. So my tribute to him that so many of us today have gathered to pay our respect to him. And also in the coming days, few days, we are going to have one more memorial lectures, or rather a condolence meeting for him. So we'll be meeting there. And I wish God give peace to the departed soul. We all will remember always to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumitra, for those beautiful words in praise of Imtiaz sir and a rich tribute from you. I know Abdul Rahim ji has been wanting to say, yes, please, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Arangiji. I was, teaching in Aligarh Muslim University in the Department of Political Science. I was never a student of Imtiaz Ahmad. I never studied in CPS. I was in the School of International Studies in JNU, from where I did my PhD. As everybody pointed out that he was a great seminarist, I used to meet him in seminar in Aligarh, mostly in Aligarh, AMU, where he on the first day of the seminar, he will ask all the friends with whom he came from Delhi to fill, what he used to call was, I am more interested in TADA. TADA is not Terrorist and Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act. It is TADA. So he will fill the forms, and then he will see to it that everybody gets a TA. Those who accompanied him. That is how I became very close to him. And when I was a student in the 80s in SIS, there was a problem from his center, that is CPS, that one student who convinced Students' Union, the Association of Students' Union, to demand re-evaluation of MPhil dissertation. Actually, there was no provision in the academic rules that if a student demands MPhil dissertation has to be re-evaluated. There is only one examiner for MPhil, external examiner, and is the supervisor. And this demand was rejected, but the Students' Union sat on dharna. An academic council meeting was called. In the academic council meeting, majority of the teachers, you can say 99% teachers, opposed students' demand for re-evaluation of MPhil dissertation. Only 3 people supported that demand, and including the Vice Chancellor, Mr. Naidumma. 4 people were in favor of that demand. And among the 3 teachers, one of the teachers was my own teacher who supervised my PhD, Professor K.P. Saxena. The second teacher was Professor Rahmatullah Khan, who later became rector of the university and also was very instrumental in reinstating Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. And the third one who spoke in favor of student was Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. He was really courageous. He went against the wind to support student demand that MPhil dissertation, if there is a demand, it has to be re-evaluated. Re-evaluation provision is there for PhD, but not for MPhil. This was the first instance which I wanted to share with the friends who are here. In 1985, when he was already put under suspension, Aligarh Muslim University Vice Chancellor, Mr. Syed Hamid, who was appointed by Mrs. Indira Gandhi government, offered him professor's post without interview. Directly, he was asked to join. He declined because he wanted not to leave JNU. He wanted to fight back his case. It was a loss for AMU. Also, if had he joined AMU, the profile of AMU would have improved. The third encounter with him was in 1998. In 1998, I was in Hamdard University. I was director of Center for Federal Studies, which was actually established by Professor Rashiduddin Khan. And there was rivalry between Rashiduddin Khan and Imtiaz Ahmad. And I invited him to inaugurate one of the seminars as a keynote speaker. Then he asked me, "Are you not afraid that you are calling me to your center, which is established by Rashiduddin Khan?" I said, "Look, he is no more now. Even if he was there, I would have convinced him." That is how he came there to inaugurate the seminar. He was a gentleman. I did not read much of his writings, but whatever I read, I was really impressed by his scholarship, by his academic integrity, by his academic tolerance. I think these were some of the thoughts which I just wanted to share. Thank you for giving me an opportunity. Thanks.
Now I can join.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Thank you, Abdul Rahim Sahib. Thank you. Dr. Sahu, you can now.
Yeah. Only, so I'm extremely, moved by the fact that CPS is organizing this online event to pay tribute to one of the legendary teachers, who was teaching us. I was taught by him during 79, 81, when I did my post-graduation in JNU. One of the defining features of Professor Imtiaz Ahmad was his originality and the breadth of vision which was evidenced in his approach to, academics. I remember when I was I was working with President K.R. Narayanan. Mr. Narayanan, as the President of India, I was OSD to him. He was visiting Italy. I was discussing this with Asad the other day. So Mr. Narayanan was invited and to participate in an event organized by Universal Academy of Cultures, of which he was a founding member. And one of the founders of that remarkable institution, the Universal Academy of Cultures, was a Nobel laureate, Elie Wiesel. He was one of the survivors of the Holocaust, in Germany. So the theme of the seminar was universal and particular. And Mr. Narayanan asked me to join his, tour to Italy. In Siena University, it was organized. And so Mr. Narayanan was writing his own speeches. He used to ask me only to give a well-researched draft speech. But he would sit down and write. But for that particular speech, he called me, he said, I want certain inputs, like at what age children get prejudices on the basis of caste or religion. At what, how do the prejudices, they develop those prejudices or acquire those prejudices? So I said, sir, I have absolutely no idea about this. I haven't read any literature. And that would be, of course, very educative and illuminating to know that how the prejudices are acquired by children or how the mind gets prejudiced, whether it's conditioned automatically or whether they try to imbibe or they are being, fed by school, friends or parents or society and so on and so forth. He said, do one thing you studied in JNU, contact Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. And I was quite surprised. Of all the people, he said Imtiaz Ahmad. And I said, sir, he was my teacher. He said, then that would be much, more convenient for you because you are so familiar with him, his teachings, etc. Because I have a feeling, Mr. Narayanan said, he would provide some inputs concerning this particular point. So same day I went to him, and there was no mobile that time, of course. So I reached his residence, and he was so happy to see me. And I said, sir, I have come here, and of course, to see you. But in fact, there is a, instruction from the president that I should contact you. He said, oh, that's absolutely great. And then we had a lovely discussion. And during that time, he said, you contact one Professor S.K. Singh or K. Singh from Patna. He wrote an article on this, the caste and communal prejudices among children. And then he gave me his landline number. Those two numbers he gave, one Delhi number, one Patna number. And luckily he was available in Delhi. He gave me his article, which he wrote some years back. Just 70-page article. And that is how I also learned quite a bit, after reading that longish piece. And I flagged a few pages, 4, 5 pages. I put some flags and went to president, and I said, sir, it's a fairly long piece, 70 pages. You may not like to read the entire text. So I have flagged those pages, and you can just concentrate on those particular pages. Mr. Narayanan gave me a stern look. He said, let me learn something by reading the whole text. Why should I get confined to few pages as you have flagged? Am I not entitled to learn something? And I felt so, in the sense, I felt very enriched by the fact that a president of India at that age and stage of life, he wants to learn something. So I immediately informed Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, sir, president immensely liked that. In fact, he used those inputs in the Universal Academy of Cultures. And in fact, some Italian newspapers reported that how in India, children get prejudiced on the basis of religious identity or caste identity, and the remedy that should be provided. And of course, in that context, Mr. Narayanan quoted Ambedkar, to imbibe the values of constitutional morality. So this is how, Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, even the President of India remembered, that such inputs can be obtained from a teacher, a researcher, a professor like Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. The other point I would like to, flag is that on one occasion, I went to him just to spend some time, and he gave me a bunch of articles. He said, Sahu, have a look at those articles. And I still have that file with me. He said, go through the very first para of the first article. They were written by a scholar from, US, and of course, there were quotes from a Muslim gentleman. So he was saying that why, there is no attempt being made by the Muslim community itself to turn the searchlight inwards, to interrogate their own prejudices, own beliefs, and of course many other practices and customs which are contrary to the core values of equality and brotherhood. Because within the Islamic community itself, such problems have emerged, such prejudices have been cultivated over the years. So in that context, it was stated that we need to have a re-look at the Islam. And there was some people who protested saying that you cannot question Islam on such grounds. So I said, sir, it's a very radical paper. He said, yes, this is the problem. This is the issue. The critical voices are being marginalized. Nobody dares to speak. And then I said, sir, can I get the photocopies of these articles? He said, let's go to Kamal Complex and get that photocopy. And then he came with me and he photocopied those articles. And then I'm going to locate those articles in my small library at home. So, so this is, a kind of a mind, an inquiring mind, an inquisitive mind, all the time, incessantly engaged in the cultivation of, for cultivation of ideas. So it was so rewarding each time I have interacted. We used to discuss at length. So then on one occasion, in fact, in Rashtrapati Bhavan, President Mr. K.R. Narayanan, he asked me, that was the Republic Day at home. He said, have you sent an invitation to Professor Imtiaz Ahmad to come to at home? I said, sir, I'll instruct the officials concerned. So then a card was prepared. I personally came on 25th January and handed it over. I said, sir, it was on the instructions of the president that this invitation has been issued to you. So please come to Mughal Gardens on 26th January evening. He said, definitely, definitely. He came and so many people surrounded him. I have seen him talking to so many people. So you see, that was the stature of the man who went through such, problems. But at the same time, I found him victorious in the midst of all those problems. And he emerged in shining armor, in face of those problems. So, there were several others. Other examples one can cite, I used to, on one occasion, I discussed with him about Bhagavad Gita, and he said, he was quite fascinated by one aspect of Gita, that he said Krishna, took Arjuna to the level of the soul, the abstract identity, from the physical, plane, the identity determined at the physical plane or determined by some other factor, that he transcended him to a very abstract level. So these multiple identities which Krishna emphasized, and he said, Arjuna, that you are not just body or these senses and so on and so forth. That is the beauty of Gita. Actually, it's very expansive in scope. And I was quite educated to listen to Professor Imtiaz Ahmad to say that Gita is so expansive. And then much later, when I heard Professor Amartya Sen, his lecture on justice, and he eventually wrote this. There he talks about, Bhagavad Gita, the discourse between Lord Krishna and Arjuna. He says that the truth lies somewhere else. When Arjuna says, no, I don't want to kill my own kith and kin for power or throne, but Krishna says, no, that is your duty to do, regardless of who they are, whether they are kith or kin. So Professor Amartya Sen says, the truth lies, there is some truth in Arjuna's statements or Arjuna's stand, and some truth in, Lord Krishna's stand. And therefore he says, this is for exploration of justice, we require to have insights from the, Indian systems and so on and so forth. So this remarkable convergence of minds, great minds, of Professor Imtiaz Ahmad, and for that matter, what the articulations of, Amartya Sen, that's quite fascinating, intellectually challenging, fascinating. He always provoked thinking and continues to do so. So his passing away was certainly sad. And I remember in the burial ground, Sumitra Jain was there, many others were there. And when that, Mufti or Maulana, he said, Koi waris hai? So several of us said, Hum sab waris hai. So we are all worries. And I wrote an article paying tribute to him. It was published in newsclick.in, and it has been shared. And so therefore, we are the worries of Imtiaz Ahmad at the intellectual plane, in our quest for ideas, in our search for, truth, or what Nehru said, adventure of ideas, which, a university stands for. I think we are we are all very privileged to be the worries of Imtiaz Ahmad. My humble tributes to such a great soul.
You are muted. You are muted.
Yeah, you are muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Sagu, for sharing your memories and reflections and experiences and the rich tribute that you have paid. So very emotional. I think one would not like to end. One would like to go on remembering Imtiaz sir. There's a word of thoughts with him that we all have. and many more who are not with us today in this meeting, but they're all over the world in different parts. And Imtiaz sir would be looking at us from above and thinking what these people are saying about me, because each one of us, as you said, can say that I am here, but a heir's responsibility is also to leave the legacy in the truest sense, of a guardian, of a teacher, of a mentor, of a philosopher guide like Imtiaz sir. So even though we would have liked to share much more and say much more, but I think the time limit prevents us from saying more. I would simply share maybe 2, 3 thoughts about him and pay my tributes to him. It's difficult to summarize. It's difficult to start from where I start and where I end, because the persona of Imtiaz sir was such that there were so many different facets of his personality which came together alive, all of them. As some of you said, that he was, such a concise and precise thinker, researcher, scholar. And I just received a old classmate of mine, I'll start with that. He says, Professor Imtiaz's quote guiding me till today. He said, if you cannot say your idea in one line, you cannot do it in 1,000 pages. And I think that's so true. As an academic, as a scholar, and therefore his writings truly capture as if the true essence of our society. Some of the things he was writing on, I came across long ago. He gave me a piece, which I don't know if you guys, if you all have read it. It was a handwritten piece that he typed it and he gave it to me, because those days I was in Lucknow. And since he did his MA from Lucknow and he spent time in Lucknow University, he wrote a piece, beautiful piece, which has been now, which came out in an edited volume on the city of Lucknow. It was called Through the Eye of a Street. And as an anthropologist or a sociologist, he talked about the idea of wandering and roaming around in Hazratganj in the evening. Ajay, you would probably be able to, relate to it. And the concept of ganjing, he drew upon from the colonial times to the post-colonial times, and how the city of Lucknow is associated with the idea of Hazratganj. It's a beautiful piece. It's a piece which is very artistic, very poetic, and also very social science, science kind of an article. So here was a person who was actually living each and every minute of his life in observing, in perceiving the reality in an immaculate manner. And he didn't have to read too many books to write his works. You could see that coming out, that he had so much to say, so much to give to the society, because he was closely observing it, being part of it, living it. He was not an outsider. He was not, as somebody said, an elite intellectual sitting in the ivory tower and reading up others' books and then formulating his ideas. So I think in that sense, Imtiaz sir, with his contemporaries like T.N. Madan, Andre Bete, Ashish Nandi, and many more, and his engagement, his conversation, his interrogation was always very, very intellectually stimulating. And he could bring that to the class. I mean, you remember those days when we did not have digital acts, we did not have digital resources. We had to go to the library, check out a book from the textbook, which was given only for 2 hours, and then return the book. So every piece of writing, whether it was cyclostyled or photocopied or typed, that a teacher gave to you was like a sacred piece of paper. I still have a file of all the articles that he gave me. And I just want to share one event that changed my life completely, which I am very proud of sharing, which I think hardly any professor will do for a student. I just finished my MPhil, and my supervisor was Professor Rashiduddin Khan. And Professor, everybody knows that, they were Bethiner, there was a lot of conflict. And part of the reason that is given in public memory is that Professor Khan was to some extent responsible for his suspension, whatever it may be. But never ever he let that come in my association with him as a student. He never allowed other supervisors influence, and he never thought ill of it. He never said anything. And that was the magnanimity and generosity and intellectual honesty, that I only have to talk to my student about the things that they need to talk, not about other teachers, even though we all knew how much he was suffering. In a small incident, which to him might have been small but very large for me, when I got my national scholarship to go abroad and I was applying to different universities, he said, "Why do you need to apply to other universities? Go to Chicago." I said, "Well, I mean, it's a very difficult. It's very difficult to get admission there." He said, "Well, let me write a letter to Rudolph's, who were his great friends, and who had actually invited him as a Fulbright to University of Chicago, where he was affiliated." Probably nobody will believe it today because we ourselves don't do it. He picked up the postcard. Those days there used to be postcards, not envelope. He picked up the postcard and he wrote few lines about me, and he had their address. They were in Missouri those years, that year, and he sent that. He said, "Go and post it." So I posted it, and believe it or not, promptly came the response from the Rudolphs, and they said, "You come and meet us, and so this kind of a, unparalleled sense of generosity, giving time, patient hearing to students is really is something rare. You don't see it, you don't hear it. We don't do it ourselves these days as teachers. To our students, we take time to write recos. So here was somebody who was actually enjoying and living his life in the world of ideas, in the world of thoughts all the time. Whether it was with gardening, many of us have seen how meticulously he kept his garden till the time he was in JNU. Whether it was regarding exercise, I remember several times he telling me and others that the best way to lose weight, because he used to indulge in eating sweets and other things. He was a great foodie. So he said, every time I gain weight, I also know how to lose weight, because then I go twice for walk, and this is what I don't eat, and this is how much you should eat. So as if he knew about every aspect of life, whether it was regarding the food or drink, or if you saw his house, how neat and clean, and he as if he had hands on everything that mattered in terms of the arts and aesthetics of life. So there is so much, such a wide world that he embraced, and he sort of lived. It's very difficult to summarize it, but as a student and a student of a teacher whom I have admired all my life, seeing him the last time in the Ames where he was admitted, I saw him 2 days before he passed away, and I went to see him thinking that he would be in the private ward, but he was already in coma and was in ICU. And I wanted to see him and pay my respect to him while he was alive. So I asked his wife if she could take me, and the doctors were very kind, and they allowed. I went, stood there, looked at him. Of course, they had closed his eyes and they had put the tubes all over, and he was breathing, and just saluted him over there and thought he's probably not going to come back. Even the doctors of Ames, where he used to go over the last 25, 30 years, because he didn't trust any private, I think he was right. He always went to Ames, were always saying, "Sir will come back. Sir, he has a strong willpower." But this time it was not to be. So on 19th morning, then one got the news, went home, sat next to him. It was difficult to see that a person who was so jovial, who was full of life, full of humor, full of wit, because he not only embraced me as a student, he also embraced my entire family, children, and so on and so forth, was no more. But that's the fact of life. You have to let, he was suffering, he was in a tremendous pain, and one would have wished that he, passes this smoothly and comfortably. So wherever he is, sir, wherever you are, we know you will protect us, you will take care of us as your children. We are all your waris. We really, really miss you. But at the same time, I think my generation before, generation after, was very lucky to have you as our teacher, who actually has shaped our lives. Probably wouldn't have been the same if you were not there. People like you not only just teach in the classrooms, they also shape our life, our vision of life, our future of life. With these words, I pay my condolences to the family and to him my tribute. Thank you to all of you for coming and making this meeting wonderful. Can I ask Amir now to come in? Amir, and I would also like to just thank our chairperson, Professor Narendra Kumar, and Amir Ali in person who organized this event. Amir.
So I realize it's getting late now. We've been here for quite some time. So just a few words of thanks, as is the formality. To the chairperson, first of all, when I floated the idea, he immediately said yes. It's a difficult time to organize these things because it's the end of the semester. We're all busy grading. But I'm glad we did this. This is the least we could have done for one of the most respected teachers at CPS. I did refer to the immense respect that we held Professor Imtiaz Ahmad. I refer to him as Ustad Muhtaram, most respected teacher because of that. At the same time, let me say that
you're muted.
You're muted. You're muted, sir. Oh, I'm so sorry. Technology really is always my big trouble. Yeah. So I realize it's very late now, so I won't take too much time. First of all, thank you to Narendra. As soon as I floated this idea as chairperson, he said yes to this. It's a very difficult time to hold things of this kind at the end of the semester when so many of us are busy grading. Of course, Imtiaz Ahmad was held in great esteem and respect. That's why I refer to him as Ustad Muhtaram, that's most revered teacher. But I must say that he also held his students in great affection and respect. So I must say a special thanks to our students, without whom CPS and JNU cannot function at all. So Supriya and Nitish, who organized all the technical aspects of it, I mean, people like me in the faculty just can't see the handle technology at all. But Supriya and Nitish immediately said yes, they would handle all the technical aspects of it. Thank you to the speakers and everyone else here. I think this is one of the most fitting ways in which we can pay tribute. Sadly, this has become something, we've had a spate of losses, which means that we are witnessing the passing of a generation of JNU professors. This institution itself has been under great stress. At times we feel that this institution may itself be broken, the kind of stress that we are going through. But I'm told that rarely do these moments come in the life of an institution, if they ever come at all. If this can't break us, I think nothing can. So we remain indomitable in the way that Professor Imtiaz Ahmad remained indomitable. Thank you so much once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take.
Nitish, you can end the meeting.
No, let everybody leave.
Okay, all right, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am.